Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Council on Black Health webinar entitled Multilevel Context of Weight Gain During the Childbearing Window, Exploring the Multidimensional Role of Neighborhood Environment on Intervention Effectiveness. Today's presentation is the second in the 2020-2021 webinar series offered by the Council's Solution to Diabetes in Black Americans Core. This core is part of the NIH-funded Center for Diabetes Translation Research at the Washington University in St. Louis. The Solutions to Diabetes in Black Americans core provides methodological and content expertise to advance the field of diabetes research in Black Americans. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. My name is Tiffany Eaton. I am a doctoral candidate and graduate research fellow at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University, where the council is based. I'm currently working with Dr. Shariki Kumanika, the founding chair of the council. I will be your moderator today. The council's mission is to develop and promote solutions that achieve healthy Black communities. We leverage the credibility and perspectives of Black American researchers, other collaborators, and research partners to facilitate relevant, community-engaged, actionable solutions that positively impact Black communities. Today's session will discuss the multidimensional nature of neighborhood context, as well as insights from research using composite measures of neighborhood opportunity access in relation to racial and ethnic disparities in key weight-related maternal health outcomes, including gestational weight gain and postpartum weight retention. During the presentation, we ask that you pose questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface. We will review and select questions for our presenter to respond to after the presentation. If your question was not selected for response, we will share follow-up feedback after today's session. Please feel free to also use the chat window to interact with fellow attendees during the session this afternoon. Today's presentation will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will publish the webinar online and share the link via email. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Irene Hedden. Dr. Hedden is an assistant professor of Black Health in the Department of Community Health and Prevention at the Drexel Dornsife School of Public Health. Her research interests investigate the social and structural determinants of racial and ethnic disparities in adverse pregnancy outcomes with a specific focus on neighborhood environment. Central to Dr. Hedden's work is placing pregnancy within the context of women's reproductive life course and developing ways to understand how structural racism operates over the life course to create racial and ethnic disparities during this critical window. She received her doctoral degree in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley in 2015 and continued on to complete postdoctoral fellowships at UC Berkeley and the Drexel Urban Health Collaborative. Dr. Hedden, I now invite you to proceed.
All right, thanks, Tiffany. Thanks for that introduction, Tiffany, and I will jump right in. So the background context for the motivation of the work that I'll be talking about today is one that many of us are all too familiar with. Racial disparities in adverse pregnancy outcomes disproportionately impact Black women's health. Black women have a higher risk of maternal obesity. They have higher risk of experiencing hypertensive disorders, including gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, and eclampsia disorders during pregnancy, as well as higher risk of severe maternal morbidity, and an all too familiar statistic that Black women are also 3 to 4 times more likely to die due to pregnancy-related causes over the immediate delivery period and the year following that delivery period. And so to focus in more on how these disparities manifest with regards to specific weight-related sequelae over the course of pregnancy, patterns of weight gain during pregnancy also have differential implications by race. So a recent meta-analysis indicated that prevalence of weight gain above recommended guidelines. And so these recommendations are by the Institute of Medicine and define a window of weight gain for which women and their children can decrease the risk of adverse outcomes. So with regards to those guidelines, Black women actually, 50% of Black women actually gain above those guidelines, which puts both them and their infants at increased risk of adverse health sequelae, both during the perinatal period and postpartum. And while this prevalence of excessive weight gain is not different compared to their white counterparts, Black women do go on to retain more weight as a result of this excessive weight gain during pregnancy. A recent meta-analysis indicated that Black women were 80% more likely to retain over 10 pounds postpartum, which again has implications for the weight they go into their next pregnancy with, as well as the development of chronic health conditions over the life course. And with respect to the impact of racial disparities and health outcomes during pregnancy having a long-term impact on racial disparities on chronic diseases over the life course, occurrences during the perinatal period really contribute to this amplification of racial disparities over the life course. Over the life course. So for gestational weight gain, a recent paper found that 64% increase in the odds of midlife obesity for each pregnancy that a woman experienced in which she had excessive gestational weight gain. Furthermore, with regards to those hypertensive disorders that are more prevalent within Black women, again, a recent study found that there is an 80 to 210% higher risk of adverse cardiovascular outcomes that developed over the life course arising from these hypertensive disorders occurring during the pregnancy and perinatal window. And gestational diabetes, which I didn't mention on the previous slide because racial disparities aren't as pronounced, but gestational diabetes occurring during the period of pregnancy increases the risk for which women will develop type 2 diabetes over their lifetime. And 70% of women who experience gestational diabetes go on to develop type 2 diabetes at some point in the future. And an additional fact is that although it's gestational diabetes is not more prevalent for Black women, the the rate at which Black women experiencing gestational diabetes go on to develop type 2 diabetes is actually greater than their white counterparts or counterparts from other racial ethnic groups. So we can see that not only do these racial ethnic disparities in pregnancy outcomes impact Black women's health during that pregnancy and perinatal window, but that it contributes to this amplification and perpetuation of racial disparities across many disease outcomes over the continuing life course. So, informed by that kind of disparate burden of risk that the perinatal period confers on Black women's health, there's been a wealth of literature over the past decades to identify the risk factors and etiologic factors underlying these racial disparities. So, if we look at this diagram on the left of the screen, there have been a wealth of factors across, clinical factors, patient characteristics, factors within the healthcare context, environmental factors, as well as sociodemographic factors that have been related as risk factors, driving many of those outcomes that we saw on the first two slides. However, knowledge of these risk factors, so the building and creation of this evidence base has not yet yielded an actual reduction at the population level in disparities. This is additionally in the context of many of the interventions that have emerged over the last few decades have actually leveraged many of these risk factors in order to see if changes in those risk factors reduce the rates of those adverse maternal outcomes that we saw in the previous slides. And unfortunately, the evidence from that intervention body of literature has shown that even when these interventions may reduce overall rates of, say, things such as maternal obesity or gestational weight gain, they don't at the population level reduce these disparities in these outcomes that are perpetuating disparate adverse health among Black women. And that really, in the past, really few years, but almost the past decade, has highlighted the fact that there's this translational gap that's preventing successful scalability and implementation of the evidence base into intervention context that can actually reduce disparities on the population scale. And so, informed by this translation gap, a lot of the more recent work has really focused on how do we place these disparities within the larger context as a critical step toward improved translation. So, women and disparities don't exist in a bubble, they're actually embedded within these external and more upstream contexts that really play a role in the way in which interventions happening at lower scales can actually be implemented at higher scales. And my work specifically has focused on neighborhood context as one of these external contexts that may be shaping the environment in which these disparities are emerging and persisting. And so there's been a robust body of literature that's kind of outlined direct associations between neighborhood contexts and maternal health outcomes such as gestational weight gain, maternal obesity. This body of literature has shown pretty consistent, although somewhat moderate, associations between socioeconomic deprivation, community violence and crime, physical disorder, as well as racial residential segregation, all related to, again, independently related outside of individual characteristics to these outcomes such as gestational weight gain, maternal obesity, and hypertensive disorders during pregnancy. And to take it one step further for understanding how these neighborhood contexts may play a role in bridging this translation gap, many of the processes and mechanisms that are underlying how neighborhood context becomes embodied are the same pathways that are targeted by interventions to improve those pregnancy outcomes outlined on the first slide. So a recent Cochrane meta-analysis actually outlined that there were lifestyle interventions. There have been consistent evidence that lifestyle interventions have shown some success in reducing pregnancy-related weight outcomes in controlled intervention contexts, as well there's been a rising number of interventions targeting stress pathways that also kind of drive this association between also can contribute to adverse weight related outcomes during pregnancy, although the stress related interventions have a somewhat more heterogeneous body of evidence showing effectiveness, and also it target a wider kind of scale of intervention approaches. So some interventions are focused on decreasing actual stressors experienced by women. Some are focused on increasing the coping mechanisms with which women leverage over the course of pregnancy to reduce stress. And some are focused on, building the social support network of women over the course of pregnancy as a way of reducing the experience of stress during pregnancy. And these kind of both lifestyle intervention and resource access mechanisms are also the ones that are embedded in place. So neighborhoods are multidimensional, and the physical and social resources that are embedded across, say, the food environment, the service environment, transportation context, and access to, say, physical parks and activities are the resource contexts that may facilitate or inhibit women being able to successfully sustain lifestyle changes that may be successful in more controlled intervention contexts. Additionally, the physical and social stressors within neighborhood environments, things such as the experience of community violence or the experiences of social cohesion and social support within neighborhood environments, also add to the cumulative activation of stress pathways that are also being targeted by interventions within the literature targeting gestational weight gain and postpartum weight retention. So there becomes this context with which um, if interventions targeting the stress mechanism when they're scaled up are, say, washed out by disproportionate exposure to neighborhood stressors, the ability for that intervention to be successfully rolled out at a population scale may be inhibited. Additionally, legacies of racial residential segregation make neighborhoods particularly relevant for understanding disparities. So, um, here on the right, we can see that this is a map of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Um, Basically, it was a map delineating all of the neighborhood areas that would be beneficial or robust areas for the Federal Housing Association in the 1930s to invest in terms of backing mortgages and housing for residents. And the green areas were designated as areas of beneficial investment. And so um, the federal government was more likely to get their money back, have the mortgages paid back in those areas as well in the blue areas, while the red and the yellow areas were deemed to be detrimental for investment and areas in which the federal government should not invest in because they were less likely to get their money back from the mortgage investing in mortgage loans within those areas. The problem with these maps are, though, that these areas, these kind of green, blue, yellow, and red areas, were not just delineated based off of the financial robustness of indicators within those neighborhoods. So it wasn't necessarily indicated or delineated based off of histories of whether people in that neighborhood had paid back successfully paid back other types of loans, whether what the median income or other financial indicators were. In fact, these areas were specifically delineated as better or worse areas for investment based off of race. So these redlined areas were neighborhoods that were specifically known to be Black neighborhoods, and by that characteristic of being Black neighborhoods, were defined as poor investment areas. And the base of this map actually shaped the foundation of investment even beyond just housing. It shaped the investment in terms of service environments. It shaped the investment of how transportation structures begin to evolve over the last many decades that now create a context in which the legacies of this structural racial residential segregation put Black women and women of color at disproportionate risk of being exposed to neighborhoods with greater adversity across more of those domains that we saw in that previous slide. And so, understanding this kind of legacy of how racial residential segregation patterns adversity in neighborhood environments, understanding the distinct patterns of how that manifests today, how that actually operationally clusters adversity within these neighborhoods is important, partially because neighborhoods that have been long-term Black neighborhoods that have been structurally and systematically divested in may have different patterns of adversity across, say, maybe service environment and transportation than neighborhoods that have evolved into ethnic enclaves that may be similarly socioeconomically deprived or disadvantaged, but may have other access to resources and may have other kind of social support networks embedded in the neighborhood place structure. And so, using composite measures of neighborhood environment may reveal particularly detrimental or supportive neighborhood types that are relevant to understanding if we are to actually then implement them successfully and effectively in translating in translating interventions to a scalable and population level impact. And so this is kind of the context for which I embarked on this research question. So within an intervention context that I'll talk about in a few slides, I really was interested in understanding whether neighborhood adversity type was associated with cardiometabolic pregnancy outcomes, some of which you saw on the slides previously, but I'll talk about more in depth in a few slides. And importantly, I was interested in whether intervention effectiveness for the particular intervention context in which I was doing this work varied by these neighborhood adversity types. And this was with the idea that as we continue to develop this intervention that stage was at a very kind of feasibility and implementation and clinical implementation scale, as we thought towards scaling that up to more neighborhood level and program level scales, how could neighborhood adversity type actually inform the design of that implementation approach? All right, so now I'm going to transition to talking about the methods and giving a little bit more detail about the particular methods driving how we chose to pursue this research question. So the intervention context in which I was working was the maternal adiposity, metabolism, and stress study, the MAMA study, which was conducted as a joint partnership between UCSF and UC Berkeley. And this was a intervention targeting that stress pathway to reduce gestational weight gain and postpartum weight retention in women. The intervention particularly implemented a mindfulness-based approach in which women experience an 8-week intervention to reduce stress as well as increase mindful eating practices. And women experienced weekly 2-hour classes with a group within a group setting of 8 to 12 women who were also pregnant at that time. And it was initiated during women's second trimester. Overall, there were 207 pregnant women that participated, and all of the women in this trial were either overweight or obese prior to pregnancy, and they were all receiving prenatal care within the San Francisco Bay Area. Women could be 18 to 45 years old, and we did restrict our inclusion criteria to women having an income level that was less than 500% of the federal poverty level. Although practically in our study sample, this actually mostly skewed toward women who had incomes much lower than that. Most women's incomes were around kind of 100 to 200% of the federal poverty level, and most women were receiving either Medicaid or Medi-Cal, which is the California version of Medicaid, and other public assistance services. Finally, this was a predominantly Black and Latina population. So switching gears to talk about how I then set out in this intervention context to actually define neighborhood adversity type, I actually took a little bit of a left turn. So instead of defining neighborhood adversity based off of just the geographic area that those 207 women lived in, I actually took it a step up and defined neighborhood adversity across the 1,700 census tracts in the 9-county study area in which women in the study had at least one address. So say if a woman at some point over the course of follow-up had an address in the Santa Clara, and a census tract in Santa Clara, I included that entire county area. And the reason for doing this is that many of the processes that shape how adversity is distributed over time and space actually operate at regional levels. And this was particularly relevant for the Bay Area, in which there's kind of a wider both housing network and resource shaping process that spans beyond just San Francisco into the East Bay, South Bay, and North Bay areas. And so taking this scale allowed me to really contextualize neighborhood adversity within relation to the other neighborhoods around the neighborhoods that the women in our study were living in. Once I had those 1,700 census tracts, I then identified 4 main neighborhood indicators that I thought that were, well, not that I thought, that I know from the literature were both associated with gestational weight gain and those other weight-related health sequelae over the course of pregnancy, and that were related, and that were available in a consistent and systematic way across all of the 1,700 census tracts within the 9-county study area. And so that was actually one of and I can talk about this in the question and answer, that was actually one of the limiting factors, that some elements that were neighborhood factors that were really important for shaping gestational weight gain or postpartum weight retention outcomes were not actually available in a standardized way across all of the study area of interest. I was able to get this robust set of neighborhood indicators from collaboration with the Kelly Research and Outreach Lab at the University of California, Berkeley, who have a really robust and quite impressive neighborhood database across many of the counties in the Bay Area. And so, leveraging this indicator database, I had access to food indicators, so healthy and unhealthy food retail locations, traffic safety, so which was measured as density of car crashes per tract, as well as service access, which I actually use a walkability measure, which measures, the closest distance to different key resources such as school, retail, entertainment, resources within neighborhood environments. I finally did include a socioeconomic deprivation index, which was a composite measure of SES at the neighborhood level across these 5 domains and 8 indicators that you can see here. Once I had those neighborhood indicators, again, for all of those 1,700 tracks within that study, 9 county study area, I then used latent class analysis to identify these neighborhood typology, adversity typologies. And latent class analysis is just a way to say that if there's these underlying adversity types that we're not, completely sure of or can't completely explicitly observe, as long as we have observed data, so observed data such as food environment, service environment, those things that I mentioned on the previous slide, we can then use an iterative class specification approach to identify what the best fitting our best fitting model is for the actual underlying types of neighborhoods within the overall sample. So as it's applied to my data, using the 4 indicators that I mentioned on the previous slide, I then went through a process of iteratively selecting or specifying an increasing number of classes. So I would start out specifying 2 classes and then evaluating what the model fit was, then 3 classes and then evaluating what the model fit was, and so on. And then by assessing those model fit statistics and identifying the one that was the lowest, that model was then selected as the actual assumed number of types of neighborhoods within the geographic domain that I was looking at. And applying that to the geographic area that I mentioned before, there's actually 5 neighborhood types that emerged. And these neighborhood types were actually cross-classified by socioeconomic deprivation, food resource access, and service resource access. So these type 1 and type 2 neighborhoods were both wealthy neighborhoods, although one neighborhood had excellent food access and service access, while one neighborhood had less access to food and service resources. There was one middle income neighborhood type that did also have low food and only moderate service access, as well as 2 high poverty neighborhood types that were distinguished by one having excellent food and service access and one having more around moderate food or service access within the neighborhood context. And then if we look over here on the right of the slide to look at the geographic distribution of these neighborhood types, you can see that they're not, randomly distributed across space, which we wouldn't necessarily expect. But one thing that descriptively mapping these neighborhood types did highlight that this neighborhood type 2 was more likely to align with less populated areas. And many of these kind of type 2 neighborhood areas also overlapped with designated federal and state park areas. And so we're kind of structurally different than those neighborhoods that were occurring within the more populated city corridors and metropolitan areas across the county space. So I actually ended up in analyses excluding the type 2 neighborhood type. After defining these neighborhood types across space, that was then when I actually assigned participants to their neighborhood types. So, based off of their address at enrollment, I then defined their census tracts through through geocoding, and then neighborhood participants' neighborhood type were based off of that census tract. So these were the outcomes that I looked at. Excessive gestational weight gain, again, defined as gaining above those recommendations, which were defined by the Institute of Medicine. And that was a dichotomous variable. I also included continuous and categorical measures of glucose tolerance over pregnancy or an early pregnancy, as well as 6-month postpartum weight retention, both measured as a continuous difference between weight at 6 months postpartum and pre-pregnancy weight, and also as a categorical indicator for high postpartum weight retention at this 5 kilogram or 11-pound mark, which has been widely used in the literature. And so wanted to define that for comparability to other studies. I use a pretty straightforward analytic approach, controlling for these covariates that you see on the left of the screen. I then use multivariable regression approaches with general estimating equations to account for the clustering, to estimate just main associations between neighborhood adversity and those outcomes on the previous slide. And then it was these interaction models, looking at interaction between intervention and neighborhood type that really allowed me to look at whether intervention associations varied by neighborhood type. For intervention associations that reach a level of significance of a point one of that point one threshold, I deem that to be significant for the interaction, because those are known to be a little to account for the underpowered or the less power that to detect those interactions, and also for those significant interactions, then estimated neighborhood specific intervention associations if those interactions were deemed to be significant. And so to move on to descriptively look at uh, uh, the characteristics of those covariates over time, over the neighborhood environments in our population, I first want to highlight this first row here. And this was the distribution of women across the different neighborhood types. And as you can see, they were not evenly dispersed across neighborhood type. And in fact, most of the women, which is to be expected based off of the characteristics of the women in our population, most of the women lived in these in one of the high poverty neighborhood types. Furthermore, if we look at the variation of covariates across these neighborhood types, we actually didn't see much variation across the neighborhood types over the different covariates. There was some borderline significance of racial variation across these neighborhood types, with white women being more likely to live in the wealthier neighborhood typologies. Moving on to look at the associations, the main associations between neighborhood type and the outcomes of interest. I did use high poverty, high resource neighborhood type as a reference category, given that most women lived in that neighborhood type. And we can see that significant associations weren't kind of like across the board, which we wouldn't necessarily expect. But the significant associations that I did observe indicated that women in actually the middle income, low resource neighborhood type had increased risk of impaired glucose tolerance compared to women in the high poverty, high resource neighborhood type, and that women in the wealthy, high resource neighborhood type retained significantly more than their counterparts in the high poverty, high resource neighborhood type, retaining almost 4 kilograms more than their counterparts. Moving on to look at the models looking at the interaction models looking at intervention, how intervention associations varied across neighborhood type. There were 3 interaction terms that were significant, and that was for or interaction models that were significant, and that was for the outcomes listed here. So that glucose tolerance and postpartum weight retention outcomes. And to orient us to the table a little bit, because it's a bit different than the table that I just showed, the estimates that will appear in each of the cells indicate the neighborhood specific differences between the intervention and control group for that particular outcome. So as an example, if we take a continuous glucose tolerance as the OGTT score and look at this first cell, this point estimate indicates that within the wealthy high resource neighborhood, women in the intervention group had significantly lower OGTT compared to their control group counterparts. Similarly, if we look at this high poverty, moderate resource neighborhood type, again, we see that women in the intervention group had lower OGTT scores than their control group counterparts. Moving on to look at the 6 months postpartum weight retention outcomes, we actually started to see some interesting and informative findings. So, looking in the middle income, well, first of all, differences, intervention effectiveness was not uniform across all neighborhood types. And then looking at the middle income, low resource neighborhood type, we did, as we might expect to see that women in the intervention group retained less weight than their control group counterparts, which again we would hope, given that we hope that our mindfulness intervention would lead to more advantageous weight outcomes for the women participating. However, when we look at the wealthy, high resource neighborhood type, we actually saw that women in the intervention group retained more weight than their control group counterparts, retaining almost 6 kilograms more than those counterparts in the control group. And this actually translated into a significantly higher risk of high postpartum weight retention. So that weight retention above 11 pounds or 5 kilograms postpartum. And so, taking these findings overall, they did indicate that using a composite neighborhood adversity type measure revealed important nuances in both the relationship between neighborhood contexts and these cardiometabolic pregnancy outcomes, as well as important variations in intervention effectiveness across neighborhood types. The first I think relevant summary of findings was that neighborhoods of differing socioeconomic status also varied in access to food and service resources. So although lower SES or higher SES neighborhood environments may correlate to having higher indicators of that may facilitate health, this was not always the case in the neighborhood types that we saw in our particular geographic location. Furthermore, neighborhood adversity type was not consistently associated with all cardiometabolic pregnancy outcomes, which we might expect. But the interesting thing was that the less adverse neighborhood types did not always confer the protection from these outcomes that we might anticipate seeing based off of the previous existing literature on neighborhood environments and these weight related outcomes in different population groups. And finally, intervention effectiveness did vary in both magnitude and direction by neighborhood adversity type, which has implications going forward for how to include that or understand that when we're looking at overall population level effectiveness of this intervention in the future. And so, to briefly return to the main question that kind of drove this trajectory of research, and will kind of is also informing kind of the next stages of this research. One thing that I think I became apparent from this work is that knowing that certain neighborhood factors co-occur to create certain neighborhood adversity types doesn't actually fully elucidate how they interact to shape perinatal health risk. And this is going back to that finding of like the wealthy neighborhood, something about the relationship between how those characteristics were relating to each other, although they may have been beneficial, were actually creating a perinatal risk environment that was not having the intended outcomes that we may expect or want it to have for the women participating in the study. And it really highlights that understanding the operational relationships between neighborhood characteristics may facilitate more effective incorporation of these multi-level elements into interventions going forward. And so that actually led me, so being able to identify these relationships more than just saying these things co-occur together has really shifted my work toward more understanding how to use system science to better understand the nuances of this neighborhood complexity. And so system science approaches kind of leverage and embrace the ability to model complexity. So instead of having to look at neighborhood characteristics, individually or say in linear ways in which, interactions are either additive or multiplicative, it allows us to look at the interconnected relationships and circular relations, and in particularly allows us to understand emergence of co-occurrence of neighborhood characteristics that may create outcomes beyond just adding what those levels of, say neighborhood adversity are within a neighborhood environment. And so in particular, system dynamics is well suited, and there's of course there's a typo, but system dynamics is particularly well suited to capture these and operationalize these reciprocal relationships, again because there may be kind of these dynamic relationships in which presence of parks in a certain neighborhood environment may be increasing, may act as a social space to increase social cohesion, and that social cohesion may feed back into the ability for women to use those parks, say beyond social capabilities for say physical activity or other recreational beneficial activities. And so there's these reciprocal and feedback relationships that may shape the relationships of neighborhood characteristics that in turn shape the structure of neighborhood adversity and how it impacts neighborhood perinatal risk. And using these system dynamics perspectives not only allows us to explicitly understand these relationships in feedback ways, but also allows us to then say, if we move, say, social cohesion, we improve social cohesion, what are the reciprocal and reverberating impacts that would have on the other pieces of neighborhood structure that would either lead it to, amplify perinatal risk or actually have the intended benefit of decreasing perinatal risk in relation to these health outcomes or these weight-related sequelae that we're interested in shaping. And so there's two projects that I'm, kind of moving forward and evolving this research in the current term. So one is a K01 that I currently hold, using system dynamics again to dig into this neighborhood opportunity structure to understand the dynamic relationships driving why certain neighborhoods have certain adversity structures while other neighborhoods have different adversity structures. And that's with relation to maternal morbidity disparities, but also there are two partnerships with a colleague, Sharon Herring at Temple, who is moving along this intervention trajectory from clinical trials and is now implementing a number of pragmatic trials, looking to scale up these trials in an implementation context. So I've been working with her to see how we can leverage both this work that I did in the Bay Area as well as the system dynamics approach to better understand the neighborhood context as a multi-level context driving the success of those interventions on gestational weight gain for African American women in the North Philly area, in the North Philadelphia area. So those are kind of two ongoing pieces of work that evolve this approach and evolve our ability to leverage neighborhood complexities to understand and bridge these translation gaps. So hopefully I'll be able to come back in the future with some interesting and intriguing findings from that. But for the time being, I just want to wrap up by saying multi-level perspectives in interventions are integral to achieving equity in maternal health, and methodologies that reflect complexity are needed to ensure success. In order to strengthen the evidence base, we need to strengthen the evidence base with regard to complexity and translational context in order to successfully implement interventions. And overall, this is what will allow us to better leverage the childbearing window in order to support Black women's health over the life course. And with that, I will wrap up. And I'm very happy to hear any questions, comments, or talk about any or clarify any points that may have arisen over the course of this talk.
Thank you, Dr. Hedden. So just to echo, we would like to now invite our participants to post questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface, or feel free to post them in the chat. And so I just wanted to start off, and you may have touched on this before, so my apologies, but I really like this approach. I think it's very interesting to consider the role of neighborhoods and environmental context. But in thinking of some of the exposures you mentioned related to stress or environmental toxins, did you find like any commonalities in terms of, based on SES or based on age within the childbearing window?
In terms of, sorry, can you clarify just like in terms of whether age kind of modified how those neighborhood contexts were embodied or something like that?
Yes.
Okay. So in this particular study, and this was kind of like a first step at really, because to give a little bit more context, in the overall study, looking at just intervention groups compared to control group, we actually didn't see as robust of findings for some of those weight-related outcomes as we might have expected. And so this was a way of saying like, well, what are the domains of variation that we might want to more explicitly power this intervention to look at in the next iteration of this intervention? And so in this current context, we weren't able to kind of look at further interactions of how this might modify, intervention success across these different, like say, age categories, are all across different kind of structures of sociodemographic susceptibility or vulnerability to these weight-related outcomes. But that's one thing that I'm hoping to do in partnering with other types of interventions that are kind of implemented at a larger scale, because I think it's a critically important, question, right? Women of different age groups have different expectations and navigate neighborhoods in a different way due to a whole host of, again, those multi-level contexts. And I think understanding the nuances of how, neighborhood environment might modify intervention effectiveness in relationship to age and other kind of socio-demographic factors is critically important, again, for facilitating that translation gap and ensuring that neighborhoods, again, are integrated in these multi-level interventions in a way that's actually effective. So I think that is a great next step for this work, and something that I'm hoping to incorporate in these next stages of research.
And so thank you for that, for the clarification. Yes, those nuances are key, so I'm glad you're looking into them. So we have a few questions. So the first is, first the attendee says really fascinating and important work. Can you clarify the racial and ethnic composition of type 1 and type 3 neighborhoods, and also comment on discrimination as a possible factor? Among other things, for type 3 neighborhoods, what do those neighborhoods look like?
Okay, great. And for that, I will click back. So bear with me with quickly changing slides. So I'll start out here, and then I'm going to go back to also that geographic descriptive map of how the neighborhoods were distributed. So if we look at the type 1 neighborhood type, so it's again, this is also in the context of fewer women did live in the type 1 compared to, I think it was the other neighborhood type was the type 3 neighborhood. Well, actually, they about had the same number of women, but comparing the racial demographics of women living in these neighborhood types, the type 1 neighborhood type was more likely to have white women. But also, if we look at the type 1 compared to type 3 neighborhood type, Black women were more likely to reside in these middle income neighborhoods, whereas Latino and to some degree, that these differences aren't necessarily statistically significant, but just descriptively, there were variations in the prevalence of Latina women living in wealthy neighborhood, the wealthy high resource neighborhood type, and the middle income neighborhood type. Now, that being said, one important thing that I think I want to highlight is that so if we look at, again, the wealthy, so that's the dark green. So unfortunately, I probably should have zoomed in on this, but if we look at that, that's pieces of San Francisco, that's pieces of the South Bay area. And for context, this is around kind of the Silicon Valley, San Mateo, Menlo Park area that has a lot of kind of high resource neighborhood wealthy businesses, those tech companies and all of that. And so the green wealthy neighborhood type, one thing that was important in describing this descriptively is that it's not necessarily, there's some clustering, but it's not necessarily that these green neighborhood types are occurring in the same areas, right? And so while Latino women may be more likely to be in this wealthy neighborhood type, the one thing that we weren't able to do, again, with the sample size, because it was somewhat limited, and we're hoping, again, to increase the ability to look at that, is to actually explicitly look at that cross classification between neighborhood type and the clustering of where women actually are living, right? So if white women are living in wealthy neighborhood types that are over here in kind of like the San Francisco area, but Latino women are more living in these wealthy neighborhood types in the Santa Clara area, that may have different implications that are important to consider going forward in terms of, again, translating this information into what does that mean for implementing different or scaling up or translating different interventions from the clinical to the actual real world context. And kind of staying with this, the middle income neighborhood type, that type 3 is a yellow type. And again, we see some clustering, but it is geospatially located descriptively in different areas. So I think considering these two, both kind of the distribution, racial distribution across these neighborhood types, as well as the geographic distribution, is important to consider. And again, this is kind of like an initial proof of concept study that as, that I'm looking to in terms of um, partnering with interventions that are have higher sample size, be able to dig into some of these nuances that will be important for further understanding neighborhood as kind of this important bridging this important translational gap. So hopefully that answers the question in a long-winded way.
Yes, thank you. We did have a follow-up. So just in terms of for clarification, was the type 1 neighborhood then predominantly white? Because you showed the table for the participant breakdown, but the neighborhood, I guess, demographic in general.
Right. I think I have some additional slides on this. So the neighborhood, so this is just the percent non-white at the neighborhood level. So this is using not our participants, right? So this is the neighborhood census tract level percent non-white. And we can see that for the type 1 neighborhood, it was around 60%, or a little less than 60% non-white. So there were differences in the percent non-white of these wealthy, well-resourced neighborhoods and middle income neighborhoods, but not necessarily in ways in which delineated that, well, actually, no, yes. So it does delineate that the wealthy, well-resourced neighborhood was more, with had a larger percentage of a larger proportion of neighborhood typologies that were um, uh, predominantly white. And sorry, those numbers at the top are incorrect. So
Thank
hopefully
you.
that
Thank
helps
you
a little
for,
bit.
yes, thank you for clarifying. We do have a few more questions. So another attendee asked, do you have a hypothesis for the inverse effect of intervention for the high income group?
Yeah, so I did a lot of digging into that to figure out, if it was maybe say one or two outliers that were driving this association, which didn't seem to be the case. If there were certain kind of differences in terms of, because when I was working with this, the study coordinator had a kind of a wide breadth of qualitative knowledge about the women in the intervention, and so we had really long conversations about whether there are elements of those neighborhoods that I'm not capturing, I was like kind of not capturing, that was consistently coming up in those women as kind of key elements of the neighborhood environment of those women who are living in those neighborhood environments, that, there wasn't anything that came out like was a clear signal of like, this is the kind of the nuance of, again, this is high risk, lower income women living in kind of socio-demographically discordant neighborhoods. So there's an element of that. Maybe there's kind of this kind of in-group out-group tension that's embedded within the social context of women living in those neighborhoods that actually may kind of attenuate what the anticipated benefit of having access to those resources would have. But the biggest thing that came out was kind of uh, it would be ideal to qualitatively assess within these women, or even within women living within these neighborhood types, not necessarily women who are participating in the intervention. But what are the qualities of those neighborhoods that may not be captured, right? What are the qualitative aspects of of those neighborhoods that may be shaping either these unanticipated, risk exposures that may not be captured by the elements that we're kind of capturing within the particular way that we've measured adversity here. And I do want to kind of circle back to another point. These neighborhood typologies are based off of the information that I had access to over the full study area in consistent and standardized ways. There were a number of kind of social environment as well as community violence indicators that I would have liked to include that are really relevant for driving these gestational weight gain and postpartum weight retention sequelae that I wasn't able to capture just due to the fact that it just varied too much in the ways that different counties were collecting that information. So I think that could, indicate some that would have been able to allow us to kind of dig into what's really going on with women in that wealthy neighborhood type that was unanticipated.
And so, Dr. Hedden, in your research, have you or did you factor in thinking of family dynamics and structures and how they relate to health outcomes independent of neighborhood characteristics?
So in this particular study, there wasn't an explicit kind of look at family dynamics. I'm trying to think. I think most of the women, because we didn't even include to say, necessarily indicator of married or partnered or not, because most of the women, or I didn't control for that because most of the women in the sample were not partnered. Um, but I do think that that's important. And as one interesting fact about the interventions that I'm partnering with Sharon Herring is that they actually more robustly kind of fill out and collect some of those interpersonal family characteristics that are important that just weren't measured in a way that I think would have been informative in this previous intervention context. But building in those measures again. So that we can look at multiple multi-level context, I think it's very robust, right? Because those interpersonal dynamics, again, also shape how neighborhood context is then embodied, and both then impact the extent to which women are able to leverage intended benefits of interventions being scaled up or implemented at larger scale. So I think that's a very important and relevant point that hopefully will be addressed in this next phase and iteration of this research.
Awesome. We also have another question about data. So did you collect participant level data on length of time in and perception of neighborhood, which could essentially impact use and perception of neighborhood resources?
Absolutely. So we didn't have, so we did have, so we didn't have those perception variables. Again, this was kind of one of those things where we're like, oh, let's look at this and see, again, do we need to more intentionally consider this in ways in the next kind of iteration of this intervention. And so it was more kind of it's both interesting in looking at kind of variation of intervention effectiveness, also to kind of like inform our design of the next iteration of those studies. And I think what arose from this is that understanding from a kind of women's perspectives from a more self-report kind of way would actually inform, again, getting at these nuances of what's happening in those wealthy those wealthier well-resourced neighborhoods that we're maybe not capturing. I think so. One piece of the intervention that would actually might be able to allow us to look at this a little bit before, kind of rolling out a set of a questionnaire or survey questions specifically relating to this, was that within the mindfulness-based sessions, women did kind of, there was this kind of sharing aspect in which there may be kind of, informal information or reports of elements of the neighborhood environment that may be particularly causing stress over the course of pregnancy. And because women were participating in this over time, there's an ability to look at, and it's not explicitly perceptions in terms of like, perceptions on specific domains of the neighborhood environment, but it might give us an indication of the degree to which women's general perspectives or heuristics of their neighborhoods might be varying across these neighborhood types. So that actually would be an interesting thing to look at going forward. As a secondary part of that, I think one thing that I'm interested in looking at in this iteration of the work is beyond just looking at women's individual perspectives of their neighborhood environment, having these more subjective measures of the neighborhood environment from other reporters in the neighborhood actually would also give kind of an important and informative nuance to these typologies and how do they intersect with how individuals in those neighborhoods perceive the neighborhood environment. Because if certain neighborhood types have certain objective characteristics, but there's a consistent kind of gap between perceptions of those neighborhood characteristics, that actually would be quite informative to what in regards to how that neighborhood is being experienced by residents that are navigating that neighborhood. And so I think that's a very important and relevant question, and one that I hope to again address with this future round of the research.
And I did want to ask one last question before we wrapped up. Have you or others thought through the implications? So what would be the difference about the intervention in different neighborhoods?
Oh, so in terms of what would be different about the intervention, if we were to take into account this kind of this neighborhood adversity type, well, I think that in terms of we did think about a little bit about that, and I think what we came to was that especially leveraging the fact that this particular intervention context, and again, this would vary based off of the mechanisms targeted by a particular intervention and how those mechanisms were targeted. This particular intervention context that was leveraging repeated mindfulness-based sessions and a group, kind of like a group session model. I think one thing that we were thinking about is in those neighborhoods in which we did see significant differences, and maybe even significant differences in the adverse direction. There may be a way of specifically leveraging those mindfulness-based sessions to understand neighborhood stresses that may be arising within across neighborhood, different neighborhood typologies, as a way of understanding what resources maybe need to kind of wrap around women within those certain neighborhood types, or what shared resources across neighborhoods might be able to leverage or kind of counteract some of the differential implications of neighborhood environment on these kind of outcome findings. So those are some of the things that we came up with. Again, I do want to caveat this with we. One of the key steps of this was to more robustly incorporate this intentionally into intervention design so that we could have a more kind of powered ability to assess the variation of this intervention effectiveness over neighborhood types. But I think in the informal conversations that we had, it really was thinking about ways to leverage the actual mindfulness structure in order to overcome some of the stressors that may be embedded in these different neighborhood adversity types, or if there's ways in which there's a physical resource connecting or activity that could be also paired with this mindfulness-based resource or intervention that would actually kind of facilitate women in neighborhoods where the outcome was not advantageous to actually be able to leverage the benefits of the intervention. We had a lot of discussions about that. So
thank you for this informative presentation, Dr. Hedden, on the role of neighborhood and context and neighborhood adversity on maternal health outcomes and intervention effectiveness. On behalf of the Council on Black Health and the Solution to Diabetes in Black Americans Core, I would also like to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We will share an evaluation survey for this webinar to all attendees shortly. Have a pleasant afternoon, everyone, and happy holiday season. Take care.